breathing and bearing still. Beyond the veil, a witness to what my mother saw through time, spirit, and stroke. The veil was breached. I am only the recorder. Let me begin the only way I know how, by asking you to let go of what you think you know about the mind, the body, and the passage of time. This is not just a story. This is a spiritual phenomenon and a multidimensional event. And to enter it properly, you must be willing to disbelieve some of what Western knowledge has taught you. Because what happened to my mother, Maggie, cannot be understood through medicine alone, nor theology alone, nor memory alone. What happened requires us to draw from every stream of human knowing. From neuroscience, we must understand what happens when the brain's temporal lobe is struck and what latent faculties may awaken. From quantum physics, we must reckon with non-local consciousness, with entanglement and the collapse of time as strictly linear. From philosophy, we must revisit our beliefs about reality, the limits of language, and the false boundary between subjective and objective knowing. From African cosmology, we must reclaim the truth that ancestors are not metaphor, but participants in our becoming. From Scripture, we must remember that prophets often lose speech before they gain vision, and those who see too deeply are rarely believed at first. You've likely heard the myth that we use only 10% of our brains. What if that's not a myth at all, but a confession? What if the remaining 90% is not dead space, but divine space? God's private sanctuary, hidden behind neurological veil. And what if, just once, trauma tore the veil wide enough to let eternity through? That's what I believe happened to my mother. On December 29th, 2024, she had a stroke. But what opened that day was not just a blood vessel. It was a door. Her spirit crossed into a place most never glimpse, and when she came back, she carried the weight of what she had seen. This work is the record of that crossing, not memoir, not metaphor, transmission. You will find in these pages the narrative of a woman who saw her son's death before it occurred, met her ancestors in full spirit form, communed across continents, and spoke to me from Florida while I was in Africa, wore the same white outfit I had chosen years prior as her funeral attire, without knowing it, returned with revelation in her body before her words could form letters. This book is my attempt to hold it all, to make sense of what refuses simplification, to honor the mystery without mutilating it through analysis. I am not the teacher here. I am the recorder. And if you're still reading, it means this transmission found its way to you. So take a breath and prepare to walk with me across the veil, into the spiral, and through the rooms of the mind that science has yet to name, but God has never left. What opened that day was not just a blood vessel. On December 29th, 2024, my mother, Maggie, had a massive stroke. She was in Jacksonville, Florida, under the care of my brother Jamal and his family. What the doctors would later tell us was that the stroke impacted the left temporal lobe of her brain, the region that holds language, memory, emotional tone, and symbolic processing. What I have come to understand is that the stroke opened much more than a vessel. It opened a veil. It breached something between realms. I did not know it then. None of us did. But my mother was already crossing into something that most of us will only glimpse at the edge of our own lives, if ever. Sur December 30, we gathered without her. The very next day, on December 30, my siblings and I came together. Scattered across the country and globe, we gathered ourselves on a FaceTime call to check on Mama's condition and hold space for each other. I was in Tanzania, Africa. James was in Flint, Michigan. Amika was in Atlanta, Georgia. Daniel was in Saginaw, Michigan. Jamal, of course, was in Jacksonville, physically present. But let me be clear. Mama was not on that call. She didn't speak. She didn't appear. We were checking in about her, but she was already somewhere else. Somewhere we couldn't reach. Somewhere most people never dare to go. And one of us, Daniel, was less than 48 hours from crossing over himself. 30th, January worse. Death comes, but she was already there. On January 1, just after dawn, Daniel died. It was sudden. It was devastating, but it was not unknown. Jamal received the call at 8 a.m. He informed Mama around 12:30 p.m. And this is the moment that still haunts and amazes me. She didn't react. She just nodded. She looked straight ahead, eyes calm, and gave a silent nod of acknowledgement. No shock, no disbelief, no confusion, only a knowing. Because she already knew. She had already walked into that space. She had already seen him. She had already made her peace with what the world was just beginning to report. IV, January 3. She called us to say goodbye. On January 3, everything changed again. This time, Mama called us. She gathered all of us, not to check in, but to say goodbye. It was not initiated by her caregivers. It was not scheduled by us. She summoned the family. And what I remember most is this paradox. She was exhausted, as though she had been somewhere far beyond the ICU bed. But she was also radiant, as though something from that other place was still clinging to her skin. It wasn't joy. It was elation, a sense of departure, a glow of someone who had touched the edge of heaven and was still deciding whether to come all the way back. During that call, she had Mika reach out to me specifically. She couldn't explain why, but she was insistent, desperate even. Something was burning in her spirit, something she had seen, something she had carried back, and she didn't trust it would survive the room she was in. A message that couldn't yet be spoken. When I finally made it to Florida on January 20, she was waiting for me. She called me into her room like someone holding a sacred scroll, unsure if it would be read or burned. She tried to speak. She wanted me to understand, but her speech was still limited, her words tangled, her eyes intense. She looked over her shoulder. She spoke in a whisper. She was spooked, not fearful, but alert. She said she didn't trust those around her. She was in Jamal's home, in his care. But she felt like something had shifted, that she had knowledge, real knowledge, and they were treating her like a patient, someone broken, when in fact, she was a vessel, someone burdened with a message they could not receive. She spoke like someone who had walked through fire and come back wet, but the message remained just out of reach. 6 weeks later, when her speech returned, so did the vision. It wasn't until 6 weeks later that she told me everything. By then, she had regained about 40% of her English. And when her speech returned, so did the vision. And this is what she said. She had searched for Daniel. She had seen his body, lifeless, before anyone had died. She knew he was gone before anyone told her. Her mother, her father, and her sister were there, spiritually present, receiving Daniel with her. She saw her father holding Amika as a baby, offering comfort. She was dressed in her white Sunday best, the very outfit I had photographed her in a decade earlier, the one I had quietly set aside for her obituary. She said she had spoken with me while I was still in Africa about Daniel. Not imagined. Spoken. And let me say this without hesitation. She didn't dream it. She lived it. Her brain, bruised, yes, but also opened, unlocked, and she walked through the veil. So what was this really? I asked, deeply, spiritually, philosophically, cosmologically. What happened here? Was this just the mind playing tricks, or was it the spirit telling the truth before the body could catch up? I began to study everything I could, the temporal lobe and its relationship to memory, dream logic, symbol, and vision, the way trauma can awaken dormant neural pathways, how quantum entanglement suggests that time and space are not fixed barriers, how the biblical tradition is filled with people who saw, knew, and walked between realms, Ezekiel, Daniel, Mary Magdalene, John on Patmos. What I've come to understand is this was a divine convergence, a sacred choreography, a rupture in time to deliver a message to the living, and I was chosen to bear witness to it. She is not a hallucination. She is a prophet. Maggie is not a patient. She is a seer. She is part of the great cloud of witnesses. She is a woman who walked through death and came back with revelation. She is part Ezekiel, part Mary, part Moses, part Mama. And what she saw is not just for us. It is for everyone who has a mother whose spirit has outpaced her body. It is for every family who has experienced a death that was already known in spirit before it was announced in flesh. It is for every person who knows that the veil is thin and getting thinner. What now? I carry it now. Not just the grief, but the map. I am not just mourning Daniel. I am interpreting the vision. I am archiving the signs. I am naming the sacred sequence. Because this happened, and it's still happening, and if we don't listen, we will lose the code. So I will not simplify this. I will not sanitize this. I will not let it be dismissed as confusion or coincidence. This is testimony. This is technology. This is a divine message delivered through the body of a mother and the death of a son. And I'm telling you now, while I still have the breath to say it, she saw it, she said it, and I am carrying it. On December 29, 2024, my mother, Maggie, suffered a massive stroke in Jacksonville, Florida. The medical report was clinical and concise, a cerebrovascular event impacting the left temporal lobe of her brain. Paramedics were called. She was rushed to the ICU. Systems were engaged. Language diminished. The breath stuttered. Brain scans revealed damage in the region responsible for memory, comprehension, and language fluency. But I need you to understand something. What opened that day was not just a blood vessel. It was a portal, a breach in the veil that keeps spirit and body, time and eternity, the living and the dead, separate. And for reasons I do not fully understand but have committed to honor, she walked through it. The neurological reality. Let's begin with what medicine can tell us. The left temporal lobe plays a vital role in language comprehension, Wernicke's area, autobiographical memory, symbolic processing, auditory reception, the integration of emotional tone with linguistic content. In stroke patients, especially older adults, damage here can trigger what clinicians call post-stroke hallucinations or confabulatory memory events, complex dreamlike narratives, some dismissed as cognitive noise. But when viewed through other interpretive frames, these episodes bear striking similarity to what cultures throughout history have called visions, visitations, and spiritual crossings. Modern neuroscience is just beginning to admit what mystics have always known. The brain is not the origin of consciousness. It is a receiver, a tuner, a filter. And when damaged, sometimes the filter breaks, and what was always there begins to bleed through. African cosmology and the initiated body. In the African world, a world I claim, study, and remember, Maggie's stroke would not have been seen as merely a rupture. It would have been understood as an initiation. The Yoruba speak of Or Inu, the inner head or soul mind, which carries the wisdom of one's destiny. A person whose body is laid low by illness, yet emerges with vision and message, is often seen as one who has been summoned by the ancestral council. A person who has crossed into the realm of death, not to stay, but to return with word. This aligns with the teachings of the Dagara people of Burkina Faso, who understand illness not always as dysfunction, but sometimes as a summons, an ancestral initiation encoded through the body. Maggie's stroke in this framework was a tearing of the veil. Her body bore the cost, but her spirit made the journey. And the sacred charge of the family is not to doubt the journey, but to interpret it. Quantum theory and time disruption. Here's where it gets even deeper. In quantum physics, we now know that time is not linear. Einstein and later physicists like David Bohm and Carlo Rovelli have shown us that the distinctions between past, present, and future are illusions of limited perception. A particle can influence another across vast distances, instantaneously, through what's called entanglement. And many now theorize that consciousness itself is non-local. It does not reside solely in the brain, but exists in a quantum field of shared reality. What does that mean? It means Maggie's consciousness could have traveled. She could have accessed the future death of her son because that death had already occurred in a higher order timeline, even as the physical world lagged behind. It means she didn't guess. She saw, because she was no longer bound by linear time or the logic of the five senses. She was inside the fold, inside the spiral, inside the veil. Philosophy, perception, and the threshold. Western philosophy offers another lens. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant taught that we don't perceive reality as it is, but as our senses allow us to. We see through what he called a priori categories: space, time, causality. But what if trauma or rupture suspends those categories? What if a stroke, painful, violent, terrifying, also loosens the ego's grip long enough to slip past the limits? In the phenomenology of Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger, being is not static. It's revealed through lived experience, including illness and mortality. Your body becomes not just a site of breakdown, but a gateway to the real. So when my mother's brain collapsed into trauma, her consciousness may have expanded into truth, not a metaphor, not a poetic flourish, an ontological realignment. Mystical parallels, the stroke as fire tunnel. Mystics throughout time have described a passage like this: darkness followed by sudden illumination, a stripping away of language followed by a return of the word, the collapse of ego and the rising of divine insight. Julian of Norwich, Teresa of Avila, Black Elk, Rumi, every culture has them, and I am telling you, my mother joined their ranks, not because she wanted to, not because she knew how, but because her body broke just enough to let the light through. What I know now, I know that Maggie did not just survive a stroke. She survived crossing the threshold. She touched what lies beyond ordinary breath and brought some of it back. And though her speech was diminished, her soul was loud. And the task is now mine, to listen, to interpret, and to translate. That's what this writing is, not memoir, but mystical cartography. December 30, we gathered ourselves, but she was already gone. The next day, December 30th, 2024, my siblings and I gathered ourselves for a FaceTime call. Mama was in the ICU, silent, unseen. She was not on that call. And that's more important than I realized at the time. We were reaching for connection in the only way we could, across miles and screens. But connection is not always communion. We gathered, but she had already gone. I don't mean physically. She was alive, her chest still rising, monitors still beeping. But I believe now, with the weight of memory and the clarity of hindsight, that Mama was already elsewhere. Already somewhere. Time does not track. Already somewhere soul precedes speech. And here's what I mean by that. The body present, the soul in transit. Modern neurology teaches that severe stroke, especially one affecting the dominant hemisphere's temporal lobe, can produce states that mimic coma, aphasia, or catatonia. The body stays, but the mind is elsewhere. But this is where science stops short, because what if the mind is not just silent, but traveling? In both African spiritual traditions and consciousness studies, there is a well-attested belief that during traumatic events, near death, deep illness, severe rupture, the soul leaves the body temporarily. This is not death. This is departure. The Yoruba might call it the Ori, consulting the divine council. In Nguni thought, it is ukulobola kwangafa kathi, a bride price paid in the inner realm for knowledge or restoration. In Western medical terms, you'd never hear it this way. But in our ancestral language, Mama had left her body for a time. African cosmology, the realms that run concurrently. In the cosmologies of the Akan, the Igbo, the Dogon, and more, there are not two worlds, living and dead, but multiple intersecting realms. And those realms are not separated by geography, but by frequency. Mama was vibrating at another frequency. While we were speaking in pixels and English, she was communing in spirit. Let me say this without apology. She wasn't in the ICU that day. She wasn't in Jacksonville. She was in the hot land of the in-between, where ancestors whisper, where time doesn't march forward, where Daniel's death, though not yet declared, was already humming in the field. Quantum entanglement, the future already known. Quantum theory holds that two particles once entangled remain connected across any distance. Change one, and the other responds instantly, as if no space separated them. What if families are entangled in the same way? What if Daniel's impending death was already communicating itself through the field of spirit to Maggie's being? She would not have known this in language, but her subconscious, her ancestral mind, her non-local awareness would have received the message. This is not fiction. This is physics aligned with faith. We think events unfold sequentially, but I am telling you, that day, we were late to what her spirit already knew. Philosophical and theological implication, the gathering as liturgy. So what does it mean that we, her children, her blood, gathered on December 30th without her? It means we participated in a kind of liturgy, though we did not know it. In African American Christian tradition, the call and response is sacred. A call goes out. The response affirms it, and the spirit moves in the space between. But in this case, we responded before the call, because the call had gone out beyond words. We didn't hear it in our ears. We heard it in our bones. We gathered because something in the spirit knew, and Mama's absence wasn't absence. It was elevation. It was confirmation that the journey had already begun, and that we were merely catching up. Consciousness studies. The brain as a locus of access. Scientists studying near-death experiences report common phenomena: a sense of leaving the body, timeless awareness, encounters with deceased loved ones, messages received but delayed in articulation. Mama's silence that day was not void. It was density. It was sacred heaviness. And we, unknowing, became her witnesses. What I now understand, we gathered to hold each other, but what we were really doing was bearing witness to a departure we couldn't see. And I believe now that Mama was already with Daniel, already seeing what would not become real to us until 2 days later. Her silence was not absence. It was presence in another realm. And that call, the one without her voice, that was her spirit's summons, pulling us into position, even as she stood at the doorway between life and afterlife, between this world and the one that waits for all of us. January 1st, the death that was known before it happened. On the morning of January 1st, 2025, my brother Daniel died. The call came to Jamale, our brother who had been caring for Mama in Florida, around 8 a.m. By 12:30 p.m., Jamale told Mama what had happened. Her response has now become one of the most haunting and confirming moments of my life. She gave no cry, no startle, no shriek. She just nodded, blank stare, calm face, silent affirmation. She already knew, and what I have come to understand, across science, scripture, ancestral memory, and my own lived witness, is that my mother did not react because her soul had already received the news before her ears ever did. She had already walked the ground where the rest of us would eventually be dragged. Western time, African time, spirit time, and Western thought, time is linear. It moves from past to present to future, always forward, never folding. But in African cosmology, time is spiral. It is elastic. It curves back on itself, loops, echoes, and manifests in symbols and sensation. Among the Akan, the past and present exist simultaneously. The living and the dead exist in mutual communication, not memory. Among the Dagara, death is not an end, but a spatial relocation in the community of spirit. In Yoruba cosmology, the moment a soul dies, the ancestors begin preparing the way before the death becomes visible to the living. So when Mama nodded, when she acknowledged Daniel's death without shock, what I believe is this: she had already been there, she had already seen it, and she had already made peace with what the rest of us were only just being told. The temporal lobe and the prophetic mind. Let us revisit the left temporal lobe, the region impacted by Mama's stroke. Science shows us this part of the brain governs chronological memory, language reception, symbolic association, and most importantly, auditory and visionary integration. But when this part of the brain is damaged, strange things begin to happen. People see what isn't there. They hear voices, receive images, perceive presence. They become, in the language of neurology, disoriented. But perhaps what the medical world calls disorientation, the sacred world might call reorientation. What if the stroke didn't damage her vision? What if it freed it? In Mama's mind, the ordinary filters had been removed, and once removed, she had access to what we are taught to forget, the eternal now, the entangled spirit field, the death that comes before the phone call. Quantum mechanics and the collapse of sequential death. Here again, we must lean into quantum theory. In quantum mechanics, a particle exists in multiple states until it is observed. The act of observation collapses probability into one actual event. Now stay with me. What if Mama, in her altered neurological and spiritual state, was functioning outside of collapse? What if she was seeing the probability wave of Daniel's death already forming, and not as a guess, but as a truth? In this model, the spirit sees what the body cannot. Daniel's soul had already begun to leave, even if his heartbeat had not yet stopped. And Mama, released from the prison of ordinary time, saw what was already real in the field. Share a biblical pattern, a mother who knows before the men speak. I think of Mary, the mother of Jesus, at the foot of the cross. She knows what is happening, even before the last breath. She stands, she receives, she bears the knowing, and she says very little. I think of Mary Magdalene, arriving at the tomb, confused but open. She doesn't understand yet, but when she hears her name, she knows. I think of Hannah, whose lips move in silent prayer, misunderstood by the priest, but in communion with God. I think of all the women in the scriptures who knew before the world caught up, and I place Mama in that lineage. Entanglement. Daniel and Mama were already in communion. I now believe that Mama and Daniel's spirits were in communication in ways that defy explanation, but do not defy truth. She searched for him. She saw his body. She wept before the death happened. She nodded when the death was spoken, because it had already occurred in the unseen realm. This is not a metaphor. This is what actually happened. What I know now. I know now that the death of a loved one does not always announce itself in order. Sometimes the spirit knows first. Sometimes the dream tells the truth. Sometimes the one we call weakened is actually stronger than the rest of us because they're standing in two worlds. When Mama nodded, she wasn't cold. She wasn't in shock. She was already with Daniel. And that nod, that silent movement of the head, it was the movement of someone who had already said goodbye in the spirit before the body was gone. January 3rd. She called us to say goodbye. By January 3rd, just 2 days after Daniel died, Mama called for us. Let me say this slowly. This time, she was the one who gathered us. Not the hospital, not Jamal, not the doctors. She summoned the family. And if you've ever known the voice of a matriarch who has seen something, you know that when she calls, you answer. But this wasn't just a call to check in. This was a summoning. She was tired, not just in body, but in soul. You could see it in her eyes. She looked like someone who had just returned from a long journey through a land where time does not follow the clock and speech does not follow grammar. But she was also lit from within. Something was glowing beneath the exhaustion. She looked elated, not happy, not relieved, not hopeful in the way we talk about prognosis. This was something deeper, something that glowed through her frailty. Something that said, I have seen what you have not seen, and I am almost ready to go. The sacred posture of the seer returning. In African cosmology, there are those who are not just elders, but threshold walkers. People who have been laid low, carried across, touched by the ancestors, and returned with insight. These are the ones we must listen to without interruption. In the teachings of the Dogon, the one who returns from the spiritual realm is not to be bathed in doubt, but in silence, so their message can be fully received. This is what I now realize Mama had become. Not just our mother, not just our patient, our returning seer. Call Darnell, the urgency of transmission. In the midst of the family call that day, she had my sister Amika reach out to me directly. She didn't say why. She didn't have to. She was desperate to speak to me, and I don't use that word lightly. This was not the casual request of a recovering mother. This was the trembling urgency of someone who had seen something too big to hold and needed to place it in the hands of someone who could carry it. She couldn't explain it. Not fully, not yet. Her language was still fragmented, but the urgency burned through the broken speech. Western medicine cannot interpret this kind of fire. In the medical model, she was just recovering. But those of us raised in spirit know, some things are not recovery. They are prophecy wearing the disguise of weakness. Medicine could only measure pulse, BP, oxygen saturation, speech coherence. But medicine could not detect the pressure in her chest to release a message, the fire she was carrying behind her eyes, the pull she felt toward me, not sentimentally but cosmically. Mystical parallels, when the messenger can't yet speak. All through scripture and tradition, the messenger comes before the language does. Ezekiel was mute until the appointed time. Zechariah couldn't speak until John the Baptist was born. Daniel collapsed under the weight of what he saw. In the Quran, the prophet Muhammad was initially struck silent after receiving revelation. In African initiation, the seer must often go through ritual silence until the body can integrate what the spirit has received. Mama was carrying something she couldn't say yet, but her soul was trying to speak, and I had to come. Consciousness studies, the brain as a filter, not a factory. Neuroscientists like Dr. Bernardo Kastrup and Dr. Stuart Hameroff have proposed that the brain does not produce consciousness, but rather filters it. What happens when the filter breaks? What happens when trauma, illness, or neurological rupture allows greater consciousness in? Mama was not hallucinating. She was not imagining things. She was perceiving more than the body usually allows. And her urgency was the urgency of a soul whose body had been cracked open, whose veil had thinned, and who now knew things she could no longer unknow. What I know now. I know that January 3 was not a check-in. It was ceremonial gathering. It was the spiritual equivalent of the Last Supper, an intimate moment in which she was saying, I've been there, I'm almost gone, but I've come back to leave something with you. And when she said, call Darnell, she wasn't calling me as her son. She was passing the mantle. She was calling the one who could hold what she had seen, the one who would not dismiss it, not rationalize it, not reduce it, the one who would write it down. And I did, and I am. The message still burning? I arrived in Florida on January 20. It had been nearly 3 weeks since Mama's stroke, 19 days since Daniel's death, 17 days since she called all of us together, lit with the urgency of a woman who had touched death and returned bearing something we could not yet hear. When I walked through the door of that house, Jamal's house, where she was recovering, I felt the tension in the air, but Mama didn't wait. She didn't hesitate. She called for me immediately. The urgency of the unspoken. There was a weight in her eyes, an ache behind her voice. She didn't greet me with a smile or small talk. She didn't ask how my flight was. She didn't ask how long I could stay. She went straight to it. She needed to speak. She needed to tell me something, but the words weren't there. Not yet. Her speech was still halting, 60% gone. But what she had seen? Still burning behind her eyes. She pulled me close, like a messenger nearing collapse. And I understood in that moment, this is not just my mother trying to recover. This is a prophet trying not to explode. The tension in the room, spirit versus surface. And yet, in that house, her recovery space, her sanctuary, she didn't feel safe. She looked over her shoulder as she spoke. She whispered. She moved like someone under surveillance. Let me say this clearly. She believed something was off. Not medically, spiritually. She believed the people around her, including my brother's family, were acting strangely. Not maliciously, but detached from the reality she was now inhabiting. And she wasn't wrong. She was trying to share something real. And they were treating her like someone who was just confused, just healing, just not herself. But I know the difference between confusion and initiation, between recovery and revelation. Initiation misunderstood, the seer among the settled. This is not new. In African cosmology, this is a known tragedy. A person experiences rupture. They are touched by spirit. They return altered, and those around them, still operating on the surface, cannot receive them. In many traditions, this is why seers were taken to the forest. Why prophets wandered deserts. Why griots were trained in isolation. Because a person who has touched the unseen is unbearable to the uninitiated. They walk differently, speak differently, perceive differently. And unless you have eyes to see, it just looks like madness. Mama was not crazy. Mama was not confused. Mama had become dangerous to the status quo. Western psychology and the delusion of truth. In Western clinical language, this behavior might be labeled paranoia, disorientation, post-stroke psychosis. But here's what I want you to hear. Sometimes paranoia is just perception that others can't access. Sometimes disorientation is actually reorientation to a truer world. The Zulu speak of ukulanya, madness that comes with calling. The person who hears voices, sees visions, withdraws from the visible, is not discarded, but brought to the elders because they may be a chosen one being summoned by spirit. Mama's fear wasn't irrational. It was spiritual intelligence in the room with people who couldn't feel what she was feeling. And I believe her. Quantum consciousness. The field is not always shared. In quantum physics, there's a concept known as decoherence. Particles that once shared a wave function collapse into different states when placed in different environments. They can no longer see or feel each other's movements unless re-entangled. Mama was still in coherence with the realm she had seen. But those around her had already collapsed into the ordinary. They could no longer see what she saw. and so to them she seemed off. But she wasn't off. They were tuned to a different frequency, and she was trying to transmit something that required a shared spiritual field. She needed someone who could hold it, and she called me. What I know now, I know this. She was carrying a message that could not yet be spoken. She was grieving Daniel, but not the way we were. She was still half there, half here. And she knew her time was short, not biologically, but cosmologically. She had made a crossing. She had returned, and she was trying to give the word before it left her. When I walked into that room, she saw in me the one who would not label her, pity her, or dismiss her. She saw someone who would bear the weight, and I have, and I do, and I will. Six weeks later, when her speech returned, so did the vision. It happened quietly, not with thunder, not with flames, but with syllables returning like birds to a tree they once fled. 6 weeks after the stroke, Mama began to speak again, not fluently, not like before, but with enough clarity that the dam broke, and with that 40% restoration of language came something far greater than a return to speech. Her vision returned. Or more precisely, the vision she'd been holding in silence was now able to find voice. And what she said dismantled every notion of time, spirit, science, and self that I thought I understood. The vision in full, a sacred revelation. She told me what she had seen, that she had searched for Daniel after the stroke, but not in memory, in real time. That she had seen his body, lifeless still, days before he actually died. That her father, mother, and sister were spiritually present, not as dream symbols, but as witnesses and welcomers of Daniel. That she saw her father holding my sister Amika as a baby, a sign of safety, of comfort, of familial continuity beyond death. That she was wearing her white Sunday best, the pearls, the hat, the exact outfit I had photographed her in 10 years earlier, the one I had set aside for her obituary photo. That during all this, she had spoken with me, even though I was thousands of miles away in Tanzania. She knew, she saw, she heard, she returned. Theological pattern. She walked the stations of knowing. In Scripture, there are moments when revelation arrives long before confirmation. Job, who sits in silence until the whirlwind speaks. Mary, who treasures the angel's word in her heart, carrying prophecy through pregnancy. Elijah, who sees the cloud the size of a man's hand while others still see drought. John, exiled on Patmos, writing things down that the world would only understand centuries later. Mama joined their number. She walked the stations of sacred knowing. 1, seeing the unseen. 2, knowing what no one else knows. 3, holding it in silence. 4, being dismissed or misunderstood. 5, returning to speak only when time and tongue align. Her revelation was not random. It followed a pattern older than Scripture itself. Neuroscience and memory. The soul remembers what the brain cannot. Science tells us memory is encoded in neural networks, but spiritual science tells us memory is also encoded in soul circuitry. When stroke damaged the brain's language centers, the soul's language kept speaking, in images, in symbols, in direct experience. And when the brain slowly reopened, it didn't just bring back words, it brought back everything she had seen on the other side. This is what some neurologists now call post-traumatic integration. But in African tradition, it is the unbinding of sacred memory, memory that was never gone, only hidden until the body was ready. Quantum theory, the collapse of space and time. How did she speak to me in Tanzania? Because distance means nothing to spirit. In quantum physics, non-locality describes how information between entangled systems can travel instantly, unaffected by time or space. She spoke with me not in hallucination, not in dream, but in spiritual entanglement. Her soul reached across oceans, across dimensions, across timelines. And I believe her, because I felt her in that window of time. I didn't understand it then, but now I do. African cosmology, the journey of the returner. In many African traditions, the one who returns from a spiritual threshold is expected to testify. They are not dismissed, they are centered. Their words are studied, their gestures watched, their silences honored. What Mama shared with me is what the Dagagara call a soul message, something delivered from the spiritual realm that becomes a map for the living. And I see it now. The white dress was not just clothing. It was ritual attire. The vision of her father holding Amika was not comfort. It was lineage preservation. The presence of ancestors at Daniel's reception was not imagination. It was cosmic ceremony. The conversation with me was not fantasy. It was spiritual transmission. What I know now that revelation doesn't shout. It waits. It sits in the soul of the stroke victim. It hovers above hospital beds. It rides the silence of aphasia and broken grammar. And then, when spirit and speech are aligned, it speaks. My mother did not hallucinate. She testified. And I, as her son, as a spiritual witness, as one trained to listen across dimensions, I receive it. I believe it. I carry it. What are we to make of this? You've heard the sequence. You've traced the days with me. You've walked through the silence, the nod, the summoning, the whisper, the return. Now I must ask the question I've been circling since it all began. What are we to make of this? Because what happened to my mother Maggie, and what happened to my brother Daniel, and what happened to me in receiving it was not simply emotional. It was cosmic. And to treat it as a singular, anecdotal, private moment is to betray the magnitude of what it reveals. This was not just personal. This was ontological. It reorders what I think about time, spirit, mind, memory, family, and fate. So what now? What does it mean when a woman speaks from beyond the veil and returns? This was a neurological event, and more than that. The doctors will say it was a left temporal lobe stroke, language disruption, possible post-stroke hallucinations, aphasia, fatigue, disorientation. And all that may be true in the language of anatomy. But anatomy cannot explain how she saw a death before it happened, why she called us to gather before she had the words to speak, why she wore the very outfit I had spiritually set aside for her homegoing, why her memories of ancestral presence were consistent, vivid, and restorative, not confused, chaotic, or dreamlike. Neuroscience can track what happens in the brain, but it cannot yet interpret what happens through it. And I believe my mother became, in that moment, a conduit, a sacred node in the matrix of human consciousness. This was a spiritual visitation, and more than that. Yes, my mother had a visitation. Yes, she saw her parents. Yes, she saw her sister. Yes, they stood with her at the moment Daniel began his crossing. But this wasn't just a moment of comfort. This was a welcoming ceremony, a transition rite. African cosmology teaches that the ancestors are not dead. They are active agents in our lives. They welcome, they warn, they walk with us in crisis. In Zulu thought, when the ancestors appear during trauma, it is because they are mediating between dimensions. In Ewe cosmology, the line between the visible and invisible is so thin, a person near death often becomes a liminal priest, speaking with both realms simultaneously. My mother was officiating Daniel's crossing. She was not simply a grieving mother. She was a spiritual midwife at the threshold between this world and the next. This was a psychological phenomenon, and more than that. Western psychology might label it disassociation, confabulation, magical thinking, grief-induced spiritual delusion. But all that reveals is the poverty of imagination in Western categories. Let me offer you another frame. It was soul memory, operating without interference. It was prophetic knowing, delivered outside of verbal channels. It was ancestral entanglement, a communication faster than thought, stronger than logic. It was sacred science, not the absence of rigor, but the presence of deeper data. She wasn't unstable. She was unburdened by illusion. She wasn't forgetful. She was remembering what we've forgotten to believe. This was a theological pattern, and more than that. The Bible is filled with moments like this, but we've domesticated them. Jacob wrestling with the angel and limping away transformed. Job hearing God not in words, but in whirlwind. Paul struck blind and receiving sight with new vision. John in exile writing cosmic revelation while the empire tried to silence him. Mary knowing the resurrection by name, not proof. These weren't religious stories. These were threshold moments. And Maggie, my mother, walked a biblical path. She was blinded by stroke, loosened from time, touched by death, greeted by spirit, called to return, and entrusted with a message. Her life became a living scroll, and I, her son, became the one tasked to read it aloud. This was an event in my family, and more than that. Yes, this happened to Maggie. Yes, it happened to Daniel. Yes, it happened to me. But I write this not as memoir. I write this as witness, because I know, deep in my soul, that other families have known this too. You had a grandmother who dreamed of a death before it happened. You had a father who spoke of shadows on the wall in his final days. You had a child who said they saw someone who had already passed. You had an ancestor whisper something in your spirit you couldn't shake. But you were told not to believe it, to dismiss it, to call it coincidence, to get back to work, to file it under weird, emotional, or supernatural. I am telling you now, don't do that. These are messages, maps, memos from the invisible, and they require response. What I know now, I know this happened, and I know what happened matters, not just for me, not just for us, but for anyone whose eyes are open and whose spirit can still tremble. This was not confusion. This was communion. This was not disorder. This was divine order breaking through the noise, and I will not apologize for naming it. I will not shrink it into inspiration. I will not dress it in soft metaphor. I will not let the world label her as out of it. She was in it deeper than any of us. And I believe her. I believe her. I believe her. What now? By Maggie Ishmel. You've read what happened. You've walked the days with me. You've listened to the nod, the silence, the fire behind her eyes, the speech that returned with revelation. So now I must answer the most dangerous question of all. What now? What does one do when the dead are seen before they are gone? When the veil tears in a hospital room? When time folds inward? When the stroke becomes a scroll? We build an altar of memory, not a museum of mourning. We are not called to enshrine this story as a sad family secret. We are called to treat it like the sacred act it was, a visitation. In African spiritual tradition, when the ancestors visit, you do not move on. You respond, you build, you name, you teach, you carry. I now carry this, and I will not carry it in silence. We reclaim the mind as a sacred instrument. I was taught the brain is a tool for cognition. Now I know it is also a vessel for revelation. When my mother's temporal lobe was struck, something opened. Not just a wound, a portal. And what if the mind is not simply a processor of data, but a mirror of the cosmos? What if the spirals of the brain mimic the spirals of the galaxy? And what happened inside her skull that day wasn't a collapse, but a cosmic alignment? I believe this is what it means to be fearfully and wonderfully made. Not fragile, but mystical. And we must begin to honor neurological rupture, not only as tragedy, but as invitation. We restore the testimony of seers and returners. The world makes prophets out to be unstable, but the unstable ones are often those who refuse to listen. What Maggie gave me is not a hallucination. It is a message from the realm of spirit, spoken in the dialect of stroke, memory, and witness. And I'm one of many. There are thousands of sons and daughters carrying stories just like this, but silenced by systems that want spirituality sterilized and knowing confined to what can be measured. No, I will not allow this story to be measured. It must be felt. It must be feared. It must be honored, because she saw him before he died. She called me before she could speak. She wore the outfit I set aside years ago. She knew things the mind cannot invent. And that's not madness. That's revelation. We create a sacred framework for the future. This experience must become more than a memory. It must become a model. What happened in our family has implications for neurological study, palliative and hospice care, spiritual trauma recovery, ritual reintegration of elders, quantum spirituality, and sacred time. This is not just my work. This is our work. Because if the veil is thin for one, it is thin for all. We tell the truth loudly. So here is what I am saying to the world. My mother crossed over, saw what she wasn't supposed to see, returned, and tried to tell us. And I heard her. I heard her. And I will not betray her by softening it. I will not betray Daniel by pretending his death was just sudden, because it wasn't. It was a spiritual unfolding, and I watched it open, and I watched her walk through it, and I was called to witness. What now? Now we listen to the stories we were taught to ignore. Now we honor the visions of our mothers, grandmothers, stroke survivors, silence breakers. Now we call back the sacred into our science, the mystery into our theology, the memory into our medicine. Now we stop apologizing for what our souls already know. Now we tell it in full, without shame, because death does not always come without warning, and spirit still speaks. And my mother is proof. She saw what we didn't. She knew before we were told. She carried it before we believed, and I believe her. So what now? Now I carry it. Now I teach it. Now I write it down. Now I open the door for others who have seen but had no language. Because that's what happens when the veil is breached. You don't go back. You build the bridge. The Threefold Witness. Part 1, the Bishop. The shepherd who also crossed. Some testimonies don't need explanation. They just need to be received with the same reverence in which they were given. This is one of them. My mother's bishop, a man who prayed with her, walked with her, covered her soul across nearly 2 decades, received the manuscript of Breathing and Bearing still beyond the veil in silence. He didn't rush to respond. He listened with the kind of heart you can't learn in seminary. He read not just with his eyes, but with the memory of his own body's brush with death. And then this. Thank you for trusting me with such a sacred gift. I listened with great intensity and an open mind. The revelation of Mother's experience is astounding, to say the least. So much of what was revealed rings true in my spirit and confirms my own experience with death during my bout with COVID in 2020. Of course, I did not have the language at the time to describe what I knew. However, even without words, I understood it all. I am privileged to have witnessed this account, and I am grateful that you shared it with me. It was challenging yet liberating to listen and learn, as this was narrated in such a clear and concise manner. I will sit with this quietly and offer my prayers for you as you move forward. Godspeed. You don't skim a response like that. You sit with it, because what he gave me wasn't just encouragement. It was a form of laying on hands with words. He called it a sacred gift, not a story. That matters, because sacred things are not consumed. They are carried, held, honored. You don't flip pages through something you call sacred. You enter it. You lower your voice. You listen between the lines. And then he said something I can't forget. Even without words, I understood it all. That right there is cloud speak. The moment when one who has touched the veil recognizes the texture in someone else's telling, because he too had crossed it. During his battle with COVID in 2020, this man faced death, not the metaphorical kind, but the kind that strips everything down to breath and presence. He didn't say much about it back then. There wasn't language for it. Not yet. But Maggie's story gave it back to him. In color, in cadence, in clarity. He didn't say it was beautiful. He said it was liberating. That word carries weight. Not entertaining, not inspiring. Liberating. Because this kind of witness doesn't just offer comfort, it frees people from the confines of silence, from the fear of being called strange, from the pressure to flatten mystery into something polite. He saw the story for what it was, a revelation, not a hallucination, not exaggeration, not a poetic spin on grief, a revelation. And instead of over-explaining it, theologizing it, or tidying it up, he said he would do something most people forget to do with holy things. I will sit with this quietly. Not debate, not dissect, sit, because some things are too sacred for commentary. They require stillness. That was his offering, and it stands. I won't add much more, except to say this. He didn't just validate my mother. He joined her. 2 different bodies, 2 different stories, one same crossing. Now cloud connected, and through him, the pulpit itself bears witness. The veil opened, and someone returned. The widow. The one who loved him closest. Some truths don't arrive with fanfare. They show up in barbershop cups and sudden silences, in gift-giving that doesn't make sense until later, in the kind of love that doesn't say goodbye, but instead leaves behind sign whisper, I already knew. That's the kind of knowing Courtney carried. She's not a scholar, not a theologian, but she was Daniel's wife. And sometimes that's the clearest prophetic seat in the house. When she read this book, she responded not with critique or correction. She simply opened her own vault. Quietly. Honestly. Here is what she shared. Brother, this is heavy, so profound. Thank you for sharing this with me. Okay, so his time of death was 3:05 p.m. I don't know if you know he died at home. He was getting ready so that we can go celebrate my birthday. So something happened between him getting in the shower. I only know that because when I went in the bathroom, when I came to clean the house, his cup that he mixes his shaving stuff in, that was out and on the counter and it wasn't there before. So I know that he was about to mix his stuff so he could get in the shower and shave his head. But leading up to his death, me and Daniel had a few conversations surrounding death, not really knowing why. When your mom had a stroke, she did not know who Daniel was. They were on a call on FaceTime. I was sitting next to Daniel and Jamal had called him from the hospital on FaceTime and he was talking to his mom. He was like, "Hey, pretty lady." And she started giggling. She was like, "Who is that? I don't know who this is." But she was looking right at him. She didn't know his face and she didn't know his voice. Leading up to Daniel's death, we don't celebrate Christmas all the time. We would usually pick and choose years that we celebrated Christmas. And this past year, we were not going to celebrate. 2 weeks before, Daniel told me that he wanted to celebrate Christmas. So now we had to get gifts and get a tree so we could celebrate. What made him change his mind, I absolutely do not know. So on December 25th, he bought Camille some earrings for Christmas, and he gave the pair of earrings to Camille. Then he gave Daniel one of his watches. And after all this happened, I'm like, that was very significant. I really feel like Daniel knew that his time was coming because of the fact that he bought those gifts for them. And those are very sentimental. He always said that when he passed, because he has a watch collection, that he wanted Daniel to get his whole watch collection. So for him to give Daniel that watch on Christmas, and then 2 days later, on December 27th, that was my children's last day seeing their father when we went to Detroit to go celebrate Christmas at my mom's. I really do feel like he knew that his time was coming. Even during that time, he had taken like a whole week off of work, so he wasn't even scheduled to be at work until Thursday or Friday. During that time, that was the closest we've ever been in our entire marriage, with uninterrupted time with each other. Even bringing in the new year, we did it. It was like we were two big old kids. We just played video games literally all night. That's how we brought the new year in. Spending time with each other and making memories and just being friends. So yeah, I do feel like he knew his time was coming. And the crazy part to me was, on January 1st, everything was hectic. I was trying to get ready so we could celebrate my birthday. I was at the salon doing my hair, and everything was going wrong. I had talked to Daniel pretty much all morning. He had called me back around 12:30, and he told me that he felt better. He was like, "Babe, I feel good. This is the best that I've felt since I left the hospital." He was like, "I actually feel like I could go with you tonight and have dinner with you." And I was like, "Okay, cool. I'll see you at 4. So to go from talking to somebody to not speaking to them again 2 hours later, you just said that you felt good. It's like, what happened? I've heard of people feeling better before passing, but is it that you actually feel better? Or is it a sense of peace that comes upon the person? But yeah, I really do feel like he knew that his time was ending. I guess if I were to say it wasn't really new to him, it's not nothing that was new to him. He spoke before about his experience in 2020 when he had died, and God told him, not yet. So it's like, I don't know. My husband, I know the reason why he was left here, even coming from the whole 2020 situation. And God has showed me it wasn't for anybody else. My husband was here for me. It wasn't even his children that he was here for. I was his assignment, and what God needed of me, it didn't come, and it wasn't complete until my husband passed away. I can explain that more if you want me to, but that's what I know. So yeah, I do believe my husband knew that his time was coming to an end. She didn't need a pulpit to preach that. That was already a whole gospel. But let us hold it open, gently. What she described was a sacred unraveling that looked like a regular week, a cup left out, a child's earrings, a last-minute Christmas, a man shaving his head to take his wife out for her birthday and never making it to dinner. This wasn't dramatics. It was Daniel's body and spirit quietly arranging his house, leaving pieces of himself behind where love could still find them. What strikes me most is that he said he felt good. That New Year's Day, just hours before he left this world, he said, "This is the best I've felt since I left the hospital." That sentence. It echoes what hospice workers and soul midwives have known for generations. That strange stillness before the end. The false rise. The lightness. The final surge. The body preparing to go, but giving one last gift to the ones who will stay. And then, the most heartbreaking holy thing. I was his assignment. She didn't say it boastfully. She said it knowing the cost. Her words are the kind that echo in the soul for years. He wasn't just her husband. He was God's way of staying with her until she was ready. And when she was, he went. What a sacred contract. What a holy love. What a breathtaking ache. I do not need to dissect this. I will not hammer it with commentary. Because when a woman tells you how death brushed through her marriage and left a trail of love in its wake, you don't overhandle that. You whisper thank you, and you carry it carefully. This is her witness, and now it is ours. This third strand comes not from pulpits or bedrooms, but from a place where spirit never became superstition and where ancestral knowledge never needed defending. In Sharon's voice, Africa speaks, not academically, not metaphorically, but from memory, the homeland. The daughter of seers, the voice of the continent. This is exactly what happened to my mom. I was to tell you, this is what could have happened. My grandma and mom having. One person gets sick before a family member dies. Well, for example, when my grandpa was dying, my son cried the entire day. And when we got the news that he is dead, he just woke up. Before my grandma died, my mom saw light from heaven shining at her. My grandma had already told guys a month earlier that God has called her home. She was not sick. She just died. Also, in our village, a guy died and resurrected, but they normally come back with supernatural powers and they take ages to speak. And when they speak, they stammer. We have so many incidents here, it's quite normal. When I was trying to tell you that your mom will be okay, I actually was trying to tell you that whatever she is going through is supernatural. Hospitals won't really do much. She didn't say it with fanfare. She just said, "It's quite normal." And in those 3 words, she lifted centuries of silence, because what the West names rare, Africa names remembered, and what science treats as an anomaly, Sharon receives as ancestral rhythm. Let us not interpret her voice. Let us listen. She begins with a knowing. This is exactly what happened to my mom. Not similar, not close. Exactly. Maggie's descent into the realm of spirit, her seeing of the dead, her unspoken knowledge of Daniel's death. Sharon had seen it before. Not in a vision, in her house, her grandmother, her mother, herself. This wasn't mystical. It was familiar. That's the difference between cultures that live among the cloud and those that have tried to domesticate the Holy Ghost. And then she offers a phrase that now belongs on a wall. Your brother passed through her when he was dying. Say it slowly. This is not metaphor. This is metaphysics wrapped in mother tongue. Maggie's stroke was not random. It was positional. In many African traditions, from the Luo of Western Kenya to the Shona of Zimbabwe, death doesn't just leave. It travels. It chooses a corridor. And the ones who carry spiritual sensitivity often become the portal, not because they are weak, but because they are open. In her sickness, Maggie became a gate, and Daniel passed through her. Sharon goes further. One person gets sick before a family member dies. Not sometimes. Every time. There's a pattern, a rhythm, a code. When you're rooted in the old knowing, you don't separate the body from the spirit. You listen to the sickness as signal. You ask, whose pain am I holding? Because in the village, illness can be inheritance. Not because of genes, but because of spiritual gravity. And Maggie, even on a hospital bed, was already absorbing Daniel's crossing. Then comes her own story. When my grandpa was dying, my son cried the entire day. And when we got the news that he is dead, he just woke up. That is the language of resonance, of children still attuned to the spiritual frequency of life and death. In Sharon's homeland, children are not dismissed. They are listened to, because they carry the echo of the place they just came from. Her son cried for hours and stopped when death landed. This is the wisdom of elders who never needed clocks or tests to sense when transition was near. They just watched the children. They just listened to the wind. And then she shares the story of her grandmother. She said God called her home. She wasn't sick. She just died. This is what the Akan of Ghana called dying in order. No panic, no chaos, just spiritual precision. Her grandmother's departure was not delayed or extended. It was named, accepted, lived into. That is the kind of death Maggie was trying to prepare for before we tried to pull her back. And finally, Sharon names the kind of return we've seen in Maggie. They normally come back with supernatural powers, and they take ages to speak, and when they speak, they stammer. This is a whole theology. In the village, when someone dies and returns, they are never treated as the same. They are now carriers of something otherworldly, and their bodies, still mortal, struggle to keep up. The slowness in speech, the distant eyes, the frustration in articulation. These are not disabilities. They are spiritual reentry symptoms. What Sharon described is exactly what we saw in Maggie. It wasn't just stroke. It was integration. She had seen the other side, and now her spirit had to teach her tongue how to speak again. Sharon closes with simple clarity. Hospitals won't really do much. She wasn't undermining doctors. She was locating the event in the right realm. This was not a crisis of blood flow. It was an event of spirit travel. And spirit travel requires different tools: the laying on of quiet, the keeping of memory, the trusting of vision, the making of room for something older than Western medicine and more precise than MRI scans. Sharon didn't read a book to know this. She didn't go to seminary to translate it. She just knew, because she grew up where the cloud still walks the earth. And now, her words remind us, this story doesn't belong to one woman in Michigan. It belongs to the soil, to the memory, to the mothers and sons, to the ancestors and babies, to the light that shows up when no one else does. She calls it normal, and in doing so, she makes it holy again. She doesn't hesitate when she says it. My grandma and mom have the power to see this. Not a theory, not a suspicion, a bloodline reality. What she calls power is what many in African spiritual systems recognize as the gift, the knowing, the second sight. Not something mystical or rare, but something generationally rooted. In the old languages of the continent, this isn't treated as anomaly. It is identity. It is remembered, protected. And in Kikuyu, there is a proverb for this knowing. Gutiri kiri kia kahia, kia ta uhoro wangai. No ordinary whisper can silence the word of God. This is not poetic flourish. This is a shielding truth, a reminder that when something divine has been spoken, even the loudest resistance cannot unsay it. No denial, no doubt, no doctrine can mute what the Spirit has whispered through the gifted. Maggie didn't just suffer a stroke. She bore a word too vast for the room she was in. She carried the kind of knowing that defies medical interpretation and confirms ancestral calling. And when she said things we didn't understand, when she dressed in white and called us to say goodbye, when she knew Daniel was gone before the call came, she wasn't hallucinating. She was operating in the inheritance of the seers. Sharon saw it. Her grandmother had it. Her mother has it. And now, so do you. Because that whisper, it's never just a whisper. It's the word of God echoing through the bones of the faithful. And it cannot be silenced. Not by the church, not by the clinic, not even by the grave. The bishop, the widow, the daughter of the homeland. A final chord. An invocation to those who still see. Let it be known that a bishop who once walked the edge of death read these words and whispered, I understand it all. That a widow who shared a life, a bed, a heartbeat with the departed looked back and said, he knew. That a daughter of Africa, untouched by Western seminaries, but full of the memory of her people's prophets, recognized the signs and said, it is normal, it is sacred, it is known. 3 voices, 3 altars, 1 witness, 1 from the pulpit, 1 from the pillow, 1 from the soil, and none of them asked for proof, none of them needed permission. Each one simply nodded toward the veil and said, yes, we have seen this before. Let it be remembered that Maggie did not imagine it, that Daniel did not die alone, that what happened in that room, in that body, in that moment, was not just a medical event, but a metaphysical emergence. She crossed and came back with a word, with a knowing, with a seam still fresh between the worlds. So what do we do now? We stop pretending this is rare. We stop asking the miraculous to shrink for our comfort. We stop measuring revelation by what theology will approve. And instead, we listen, we remember, we reclaim. Because there is a cloud, and it is not a metaphor. There are witnesses, and they are not silent. And the Spirit of the living God, still wild and unhoused, moves among us whispering, "This is not strange. This is the inheritance. This is not myth. This is memory. This is not new. This is your name. So come now, you who have seen, you who have heard, you who have touched hands that went cold before the machines knew it, you who dream things before they happen, you who feel the dead before the phone rings, you who cry for reasons you can't explain. Come now. This is your witness too. And you are not crazy. You are called. You are connected. You are cloud carried. And now, like Maggie, like Courtney, like Sharon, you are no longer alone. Let every whisper stand. Let every witness rise. Let the cloud speak. And may you never again forget how to listen. The cloud was never silent, a charge to the living, a witness to the word. There is a sacred grief in knowing that most people will never believe what they've seen. They will bury the dream, silence the voice, doubt the feeling, dismiss the vision, and return to the numbness of their routines, because the church trained them to ignore everything God already built into them. But I have written this book as both fire and map, because the cloud of witnesses is not just something we're surrounded by. It is something we are summoned into, and it is time to wake up. What happened in this book is not the exception. It is the pattern. My mother had a stroke, but what opened that day was not just a blood vessel. It was a dimension. She saw things before they happened, spoke things across oceans, met ancestors, stood in divine communion, came back changed. And what she lived out isn't rare. It's just rarely believed. Because we were taught to dismiss our deepest spiritual instincts and call it humility. We were taught to suppress divine experience and call it doctrine. But I'm done with suppression. What happened is what the Bible already told us happens. We just forgot how to listen. The Bible was always mystical. Don't let Western rationalism rob you. Jesus speaks with dead men on a mountain, 17. Paul enters the third heaven and doesn't know if he's in his body or not, 2 12. John writes entire cosmic revelations in exile with no audience but the Spirit. Philip is teleported after a baptism, Acts 8. Elijah calls down fire and is carried away in wind. Daniel, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Jeremiah all describe visions that defy natural law. The Bible is a book of portal moments. So why do we expect our lives to be devoid of them? Why are we surprised when Spirit shows up the same way it always has? Why do we treat Revelation like ancient history instead of a living inheritance? The cloud of witnesses is not a metaphor. Since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, Hebrews 12:1, they're not watching from the rafters. They're with us, not as memories, as spiritually entangled agents. That's why you feel them, why they come in dreams, why their names still make the atmosphere shift, why you smell your grandmother's perfume when no one else is in the room, why your child says something they should have no way of knowing. That's not sentiment. That's the cloud, and it's calling your name. The spiritual technologies are real, and you already have them. These are not spiritual gifts reserved for the elite. These are tools you were born with. What we call spiritual technologies, the Bible simply calls faith, vision, discernment, prophecy, remembrance, and walking in the Spirit. Here's what's already in your possession. Dreams, not just sleep stories, but divine downloads. Premonitions, your soul responding to what's already true in the Spirit. Deja vu, the echo of your eternal knowing breaking through time. Ancestral presence, the cloud showing up with comfort, clarity, and commission. Prophetic urgency, that feeling you get when you must say something, even if you don't know why. Spiritual time travel, knowing something before you've learned it. You have these. They are not extra. They are core to your calling. What does Jesus say about all this? The works I do, you shall do also, and greater works than these. John 14:12. Greater doesn't mean flashier. Greater means wider, more multiplied, more embodied in you. Jesus didn't say that so we could admire him. He said that to release us. You're not supposed to stay on the shore forever. You are the walking on water generation, the veil-torn people, the Spirit-breathed body. So stop shrinking. What you must now do. You've seen too much to act like you haven't. You've heard too much to pretend it was nothing. You've felt the shift. You've seen the sign. Now you must step into your full inheritance. 1. Trust what your spirit knows, even if your theology hasn't caught up. 2. Pray with your eyes open. Watch the world. Watch the wind. Watch the signs. 3. Write your dreams down. They are not decorations. They are directives. 4. Call your ancestors by name with reverence, not fear. If they are in the cloud, they are not gone. Expect greater. Speak it. Walk in it. Don't apologize for it. This is what it means to live with the veil open. To the unchurched who still believe, you were never far from God. The door is already open. To the barely churched, you've had questions the pulpit was afraid to answer. Trust your hunger. To the overchurched, it's time to unlearn what taught you to doubt your divine intelligence. To the dreamers, the seers, the whisper hearers, the slow-burning prophets who don't know what to call themselves, you are not alone. You are not mistaken. You are not disqualified. You are already in the story. And to those who still wonder whether Maggie, my mother, was just confused, let me say again what I'll say forever. She wasn't confused. She was carrying revelation. And now, so are you. Now is always ever, and ever is as always was. Go in power. Live unveiled. The cloud is still speaking. Are you ready to speak back?